Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for this virtual presentation tonight. My name is Ryan Connery with the Essex National Heritage Area. Today is Tuesday, April 13th, 2021, and we're happy to welcome local author Dyke Hendrickson to talk about his most recent book, highlighting an important natural resource and part of the landscape of the heritage area. A few important notes before we begin. First, there are live captions available for those that would prefer them. In the menu at the bottom of your screen, you'll want to select closed caption and then the show subtitle to enable that feature. To turn it off, you can hit hide subtitle. Following the presentation, there will be a Q&A with the author. Please submit your questions by typing them into the chat function at any point during the talk, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And finally, this presentation will be recorded and made available on the Essex Heritage YouTube channel. We will provide a link to the recording to all the attendees once that is uploaded. And now we can get to the program. Dyke Hendrickson is an author, journalist living in Newburyport. He has written 6 books. His most recent is Merrimack, the Resilient River, an illustrated narrative of the most historic river in New England. Hendrickson calls the book part history and part call to action, as the 117-mile Merrimack River is sometimes getting dirtier, not cleaner. The author provides insight on the river's remarkable past, including the birthplace of the Coast Guard, the establishment of the first major textile mills in the country, the site of a scientific breakthrough in clean drinking water, and one of the first successful labor strikes. Hendrickson interviewed more than 50 North Shore residents for the well-researched text, and he has included more than 75 color photographs of the majestic waterway. He is currently a historian with the Merrimack River Watershed Council. In that role, he speaks on Zoom to clubs, associations, and historical gatherings on the history of the Coast Guard and of the Merrimack River. His maritime writing began several years ago when he produced a multi-part series for the Daily News, the local newspaper in Newburyport, on the 250th anniversary of that city. Hendrickson then researched and wrote Nautical Newburyport, a history of captains, clipper ships, and the Coast Guard, published by the History Press in 2017. In 2020, he published New England Coast Guard Stories, Remarkable Mariners. The book on the Merrimack River from Fonthill Media will be released on April 25th. Hendrickson graduated from Franklin and Marshall College with a degree in history, and he did graduate work at the University of Maine, Orono. He is a former writer and/or editor with the Portland Press Herald, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, the Boston Herald, and the Daily News in Newburyport. Other publications he has written for include USA Today, the Boston Globe, and Tennis Magazine. So with that, let's welcome Dyke Hendrickson to begin the presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you for your patience. If there was any difficulty with the technology, it was at my end, I assure you. Anyway, I love to speak about the Merrimack River. I have done several books on it. And as a journalist, I've also followed very closely the work that elected officials and community officials are doing to make the river cleaner. It has not always been clean, and we're going to go through somewhat of the history, and then we'll see some of the people who are doing very good work in cleaning it up. The Merrimack was discovered in 1605 by Samuel de Champlain, but the French didn't stay. The English stayed on the North Shore. Newbury was created in 1635, and in 1764, Newburyport broke away and became its own community. This is the river's opening. It's very narrow and quite shallow, a 12 to 16 foot draw at low tide. So it's remarkable that Newburyport became a very significant shipbuilder and center of nautical commerce. And Samuel Eliot Morison, one of the great historians of the 20th century, said that there was no community and no area that was more vibrant than the Merrimack and Newburyport when shipbuilding was underway. Here you can see a little bit of how the river starts and how it flows. It's 117 miles long. It starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. It comes down to Lowell, where the 3 is, and then heads east. It's one of the historic rivers that we have here, and it has one of the most remarkable histories. when we talk about shipbuilding, here's an example of it. Look at the size of those ships, almost 300 feet long, 500,000 tons. This is Newburyport, and some of the ships actually dwarf the commercial buildings. This painting was done by Richard Burke Jones of Newburyport. He is the city clerk in Newburyport, but he's so much more, as you can see. And what a fine artist. And this is the way it looked in about 1855. Here is a wonderful photo of the ship Symington when it was being launched in about 1893. This was one of the last tall ships to be built here, because once the ships got so large and were so heavy, they could leave the port of Newburyport, but they could not come back laden with cargo. But it was a huge event, as you can see. In the foreground, women have dressed up towards their children here, the horse and buggies that brought people down. On the left, you can see some of the construction that was going on. So this was a remarkable shipbuilding community. And when I say the Merrimack area, it included Amesbury, Salisbury, up to Haverhill. It was a remarkable place. And I like to think it was probably full employment, if that term can be used. If you weren't working on the ship itself, you might be doing carpentry, you might be helping out with food or supplying goods for the ship. So this is really a remarkable photo. And you can see how many people got involved. Frequently, when the ships got this large, they would put the mast on a bit later. I mean, they put it out into the water, it would soak up the water, it'd be ready to go, and a little later, the masts were put on. In about the 1820s, things changed farther upriver. The Industrial Revolution had started, and in Lowell and later in Lawrence, they used hydropower to create large textile mills. Actually, the Lowell and Lawrence were kind of the Silicon Valley of the era. Hydropower was new. It was a way to create energy, and they built some of the largest textile mills in the world. With that came some downsides. There was a lot of pollution. Many fish could no longer get up the river. But the way things happened in the 1820s with the start of the mills, Henry David Thoreau, as you might read the caption there, was, even way back in 1839, he wrote a book called 2 Weeks on the Merrimack and the Concord Rivers. It was written in 1839, it was published in 1849. But he at the time said, geez, this is not good for fish. These mills are not good for wildlife. They're stopping the natural flow of things. But as we know, he was a naturalist, but he saw way early that even good things could happen, but some things that weren't so positive also occurred. Here's a picture of the Spigot River in Lawrence, close by the Merrimack. I think you can see in the late 19th century, there were many mills there. Once the railroad started coming here, there was an acceleration of mills, and they could bring the cotton in from the south. They could send it out again on trains. The mills did have an exploitive tone to them towards the beginning of the 19th and 20th centuries. They were kind of not paying a lot of money. It could be dirty, it could be hazardous. But on the other hand, the mills on the North Shore provided work for so many thousands of people. And these, say 1850 to 2000, we're talking about. There was a famine in Ireland. Different parts of Europe were persecuting Jews, the Greeks, Armenians, many different groups of people came over to America, and they took those early jobs. And I think, it can always be stated they were exploitive or whatever, but my view, and I talked to many mill workers numerous years ago when I did a book on the French Canadians who came down, a lot of the people appreciated the jobs. It gave them a start in this new country. And so I think it's always a mixed blessing when we think about the mills. Here's a wonderful shot of one of the largest clocks in the world. At the time, it was second only to Big Ben in London. And clocks such as these in Lawrence were very useful. Most mill workers did not have pocket watches, and so they could not only see what time it is, but remind themselves what time their shift started. Here's a dynamic photo. Of course, when we talk about the Merrimack, we're also talking about New Hampshire. This is Manchester, New Hampshire in 1936. This is the Ameskeag Manufacturing Company. And the Ameskeag had been an enormous producer in the 19th century, one of the largest in the world. By 1936, when this started, it had faded. It wasn't full, it wasn't working to full capacity. But this flood of 1936 was really incredible and probably was the last knell for the Ameskeag Manufacturing Company in Manchester, because it was very hard to rebuild at that point. The flood of 1936 was not only indigenous to Manchester here or the Merrimack, but the rivers in Maine and Connecticut. It was tremendously damaging, but I wouldn't say picturesque. The photos that have been taken are quite provocative, and you can see the power of the Merrimack River right there. Here is the Merrimack again. Spring is here, summer couldn't be too far behind, and this is where the river meets the ocean. However, there's a sandbar here that's been cropping up for centuries, actually, and mariners who come here and are newcomers to the area frequently don't know that there's a sandbar there. And when I was a reporter with the Daily News here in Newburyport, it seemed like once a month I would go out and, someone had come up on the sandbar because it was low tide. They didn't know it was there. But I think you can see the beauty of the river. Those jetties were put there within 6 or 8 years. $10 million per jetty. There are 2 jetties. It was federal money. The people wanted to improve the navigation here in the river. And I think, Newburyport and other communities have really become centerpieces for tourism and boating. Last year, 1,500 vessels were moored or kept in slips in Newburyport, and about 500 more were in Salisbury, Amesbury, or launched at Cashman Park. So because the river got cleaner starting in the early 70s, and we'll talk about that, this is a great area for recreation. The Coast Guard is a famous institution of the Merrimack River. The Coast Guard was founded in 1790 in Newburyport. Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And what happened was Alexander Hamilton was a Secretary of the Treasury, and he went to President George Washington in 1789 and said, we don't have any money in the Treasury. So President Washington, who could be droll at times, said, I know that, do you have any suggestions? And he did. Hamilton had suggestions. He was raised in the West Indies. He knew a lot about trade. And he said, let's build 10 revenue cutters, these were small 60-foot boats, who would go up and down the New England coast. They would stop smuggling. They would board ships and make sure they're paying their adequate duties. And so the first of these 10 revenue cutters was built in Newburyport. It was called the Massachusetts. That is why this Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. Now, there are outliers in Salem and Marblehead, Annapolis, who sometimes say that they are the birthplace. But in 1965, President Lyndon Johnson signed a proclamation saying that Newburyport was, in fact, the birthplace of the Coast Guard. I should mention that the word Coast Guard wasn't introduced until 1915. We had the Revenue Cutter Service, and then they merged with the Rescue Life-Saving Service in 1915. And then in 1939, the two of those merged with the services that did lighthouses, lighthouse service. So 1915, we get the word Coast Guard, and 1939, it was finalized. Merrimack is a fine place to keep a boat. And this is in Amesbury. Across the way is Maudsley State Park. I know that some of what we read in the newspapers and some of my presentation is about pollution or difficulties, but it's still a beautiful waterway, as you can see. And Maudsley State Park, which was acquired in about 1985, is a real addition to the local community. Again, look, this is Maudsley across the way, and you can see how beautiful parts of the river can be. In recent years, as the river has gotten cleaner, and it started in 1972 with the Clean Water Act that Senator Ed Muskie of Maine got through the Congress, numerous communities have made a comeback, and Haverhill is one community. You can see new buildings on the river. Some are from UMass Lowell. There's Northern Essex Community College has classrooms. There are apartments. So Haverhill is making a comeback, as many communities are. In Lowell, many people love to hear about the history of the mills on the Merrimack, and the National Park Service in Lowell runs vessels in the summer so they can talk about the past. There are close to 5 miles of locks and canals and waterways and, areas of water that are held back so they can go forward and push the mills the following day. Now, they're not doing it right now, but I think you can see that this is a national park, one of the first ones in 1978, and it provides a wonderful history of the Merrimack and the mills that grew up upon it. The Merrimack starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. This looks like it may have looked like, 2 or 3 centuries ago. It's a wonderful spot. The Pemi River and the Winnipesaukee River meet together, and this is fast water near the waterway. So I was in Franklin, New Hampshire, and I'm asking people, is there a formal beginning of the Merrimack River? And someone said, well, we haven't marked it as of yet, but go down to the high school parking lot, put your head out looking east, and you'll see what we think is the beginning of the Merrimack River. So Franklin, New Hampshire, there it was. But I think you can see how beautiful the river still is. And this is New Hampshire. This is the Nashua River and the Merrimack merging in Nashua. It was a similar situation. I went to a convalescent home and one chap was sitting out in the parking lot. And I said, I'm looking for the beginning of the Nashua River where it meets the Merrimack. And he looked at me like I was semi-crazed, but he got into the whole thing. And he said, walk down, walk through the woods, don't fall off of the steep cliff there. And that's where it is. So 11 tributaries or small rivers add to what the Merrimack River is. And this is the Nashua River. Here's Manchester, New Hampshire, once again, and they still supply a lot of power. Now, the North Shore and many communities do not generate as much power or commerce as once was the case, but scores of small energy companies use the Merrimack River to create electricity, to run mills, to run houses. And another element, talking about statistics, is that close to 500,000 people still get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. This is not the case downriver. Newburyport, for instance, gets its water from the Artichoke and some wells. But 500,000 folks, including some in Lawrence, North Andover, and Haverhill, still get their drinking water. The science is good, and much has been done to make sure the water is good. But of the statistics that I learned, that struck me as significant. And I think that's another reason why we have to be concerned about the cleanliness of the river. When factories go in upriver, or when scientific companies go in New Hampshire or on the North Shore, there has to be some significant monitoring to make sure that what they're putting in the river, and granted they are cleaning it, it has to be clean because 500,000 people are getting their drinking water. Here is Lowell. It's a wonderful shot. Umass Lowell is on the right, and you can see part of the waterworks per se. Much cement went in, much planning went in terms of harnessing the river. There's still many factories in Lowell and in Lawrence, that use the hydropower created by the Merrimack. And Lowell, this is upriver from Lowell. There's some fishermen trying their luck. There's some joggers. There are some people walking their babies. So the Merrimack is certainly a wonderful recreation area for people in the North Shore. Here's Lowell again. And again, some of the old factories and textile mills have been refitted, some haven't. And I say to myself, in addition to textiles and wool and whatever that the mills made in the 19th century, the art and business of brick making must have been quite amazing. Look at all the bricks. And if you've driven on 495 past Lawrence, I mean, the amount of brick is really astonishing. So if I run out of things to write about, I might do something on the brick making industry. And here's Manchester. It has had a major comeback. They have refashioned many of their buildings. On the right, you can see some of the old Amesquig mill buildings, and then you can see what we Northern New Englanders might call skyscrapers. They're motels or businesses, and Merrimack has helped the city over the years. And here's Manchester, which has done a great deal to help refashion their city. Here is a great, I wouldn't call it a sporting event. This was an information event, I would call it. In the August of 2019, 14 to 16 hardy folks started in Franklin, New Hampshire and kayaked down to Newburyport. It took 4 days. They had to get their own meals on the run. Well, that's a bad metaphor, but they had to get their own meals in the evening. So that's Jim Kelcourse in the first one. And then Lane Glenn, who is the president of Northern Essex Community College, is behind him. These public officials wanted to get two things out. They wanted to bring to the attention what an asset the Merrimack is. And I think they also wanted to point out that there was difficulty with pollution from time to time. Here are the voyagers once again. I think close to 20 did a little bit of the paddling. 12 to 14 probably did all 4 days. And Diana DiZoglio, who is a state senator from the North Shore, Jim Kelcourse were two of the ones that went the entire time. So this was a major effort. Again, it's 117 miles. And they were concerned about pollution as well as exercise. One of the key areas of pollution on the Merrimack is combined sewage discharges. And this occurs when communities like Lawrence and Lowell and Manchester, their pipes going into the sewage treatment plants bring the sewage into the treatment plant, but they also bring water, surface water. So if there's a big rainstorm, a great amount of surface water and rain goes into the sewage treatment plant along with the effluent. These plants cannot accommodate everything, so they release it. It's a discharge. And so that is where we get a lot of pollution and effluent in our river in the summertime when it rains hard. Now, executives and public officials have been working to stop that. Our governor recently signed a bill which says if you have a discharge upstream, such as Manchester or Lowell, you have to report that, you have to make it known downstream. So that is a big area of pollution, the combined sewage discharge, and people are working, number one, to limit it, and number two, to tell people about it. I might mention Manchester, New Hampshire, which is the largest polluter on the Merrimack, recently went into an agreement with state and federal officials. They're going to have a $132 million program to improve their sewage treatment plant. It's a 20-year program, but this shows that some progress is being made. Here's a familiar picture to me. My wife and I live in Newburyport. And as I mentioned, in recent years, starting in 1972, the river has gotten much cleaner. And just like numerous communities along the Merrimack, it has become an area that people like to visit. And here's another beautiful spot, the Amesbury line where it meets the Merrimack line. And I might mention, because I've had this question. Merrimack River is spelled with a K. There are numerous spellings of Merrimack, such as the town, such as the avenue in Newburyport are spelled with a C. I think that comes from different map makers in the old days, going back to the turn of the 20th century. But in 1909, the State House in Boston said, or signed a decree that Merrimack, the river, would be spelled with a K. So, I mean, that was a small detail, but I was glad to have that cleared up. Fishing has diminished somewhat since the old days. Here are some, I'd say there's 6 to 10 boats in Newburyport. And there are people who can make money at it, but as you may have gleaned from news reports, and the federal government has, is much stricter with how many fish you can catch. They're much stricter with the fishermen. And it wasn't the small fishermen who made it so difficult for fishermen to exist. It was, you may recall, these factory ships that would be off of the Atlantic, such as Norway, Japan. They really took an enormous amount of fish out of here. I might say that fishing over the years, and I'm going back to the 19th century, say 1850, was very, very dangerous. 2 to 4 men, and they were all men, would get into a vessel. Some would go out for the day, some would go up to the Maritimes. But in 1852, there was something called the Yankee Gale. And so there were ships from Boston past Portland, Maine, that were fishing as they normally do. The gale came along and 92 ships were lost in one gale, and 24 of them were from Newburyport. So that was an enormous loss to the community, the sorrow, the loss of fathers and brothers and husbands, much has been amazing. But fishing was a very difficult thing. The better born folks along the Merrimack, they probably went into trade or they went to shipping. They take a vessel off to India or China. The vessels here could just sail an enormous length of distance. And perhaps the less born went into fishing. And it both could be very dangerous. But I just remember hearing that statistic about the Yankee Gale. There was no way they could predict it. And 92 vessels from the North Shore were lost. Now, here are a couple happy campers, although they're not to their camp yet. That is State Rep Jim Kelcourse in the stern and State Senator Diana DiZoglio in the bow. This is part of the Voyagers. And it's, this must have been one of their best moments because, people told me when I talked to them, when they landed in Newburyport, boy, this was tiring. I am exhausted. I'm going to go home and sleep for, a week. Many of us have said that. But, when the camera's out there, you've got to perform. And both of these elected officials have done a great deal to improve the river. Here is one of my favorite characters. She was not on the Voyagers trip, by the way. Ellen Swallow Richards was really a remarkable person. In the 1880s, a lot of typhoid was breaking out in Lawrence, Massachusetts. Now, they did have scientific cleaning of water, but it wasn't that good. So Ellen Swallow Richards was at MIT at the time, and the governor, named a 6-person board to say, can you please go to Lawrence and find out what's wrong? Now, there were men, most of them were men, but she's a woman, and I thought I'd give a woman a shot because she was so remarkable. She was the first woman graduate of MIT in 1883. She was known as the mother of home economics. She would go and talk to families in Cambridge and Boston and talk about diet, talk about having a cleaner kitchen. And this wasn't done in those days. She even started a free lunch program for youngsters in Cambridge, where she lived. And because this is well over a century ago, she realized that many kids did not get full nourishment. And of course, I like her name. Ellen Swallow was her maiden name. And if you're going into the water business, particularly drinking water, Ellen Swallow is a great name. She married her professor, who was Professor Richards, and became Ellen Swallow Richards. But she was really a remarkable woman. And one random fact that sticks with me, a couple of years ago, MIT had a kind of a poll, unofficial, looking back at their past, and they named the 150 most innovative graduates of MIT, and she was number 8. Can you imagine that? The first woman to graduate from MIT was a really remarkable woman. Much of the clean water we have today at the Merrimack and also Maine, Connecticut, and the whole country is a result of Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine. He was very forceful in making the Clean Water Act come to life. He had tried to be vice president with Hubert Humphrey in '68. He had tried to get the Democratic nomination for president in '72. This did not happen, but he was a very persistent person. He grew up in Rumford, Maine on the Androscoggin, which is very dirty, and he knew his way around pollution, but he was very important in the Clean Water Act of 1972. Here's a shot of him in '68. We mentioned that he ran for vice president with Humphrey, and he was really, a great warrior for clean air and clean water. And even though he didn't get to higher office, although he was Secretary of State towards the end of his go, he had more than 33 public hearings around the country to talk about clean water. And his wife, Jane, is to his left there. I think you can see her. But he was really a titan in clean water. And this is actually, most people learning this, that 1972 was a very big year for clean water. Another person who has helped the Merrimack and other rivers is Senator George Mitchell. This is not as well known, but I did speak with a veteran of the EPA, and he mentioned, well, don't forget to talk about George Mitchell. In 1987, President Reagan wanted to get rid of the federal block grants for sewage treatment plants. For whatever reason, he didn't want to give money to the communities. Mitchell was a great negotiator. In fact, he wrote a book a few years ago titled The Negotiator. And he said, okay, you can get rid of the block grants, the free money, but please let us have low interest loans so that communities can keep up their work on improving sewage treatment plants and also having more regulation of the substances that go into the river. And he was able to get that passed. It was, a great moment, not as well known, but it's just very important to get the money going. Now, there's several people on the North Shore, Congresswoman Lori Trahan of the Lowell area, Congressman Seth Moulton of the North Shore, who are trying to get this money as we speak, these low interest loans to help communities improve their sewage treatment plants. Now, as I understand it, the rate is 1.5 now, and that's a pretty low rate. I call that low interest. Another champion of the Merrimack was Paul Tsongas. He probably isn't as well known about the river, but he certainly was a champion of Lowell. But he at that period of time, he did a great deal of work for the river and was a great advocate for the North Shore. I love this photo taken many years ago. There's Nikki Tsongas in the big photo, and of course also down at the bottom, she was a congresswoman, of course, from this area. But both of them worked for good causes, and it was unfortunate that Paul Tsongas he had a full life, but he was taken a bit early. He died at the age of 56 in 1997. Here is his gravesite along the Merrimack. And the first time I saw this, I was very moved by it. He worked so hard. He had health issues and was taken too early, but this is the site of Paul Tsongas. Here is a fine photo, the Whittier Bridge, and that's, going over Newburyport across the Merrimack. I always, as a journalist, I'm conscious of statistics, and this started out at $292 million. It went to 310 million, and the last thing I saw was 330 million. But suffice it to say The bridge is finished, and it's a great addition to the North Shore, and it was done in good time. Here is one challenge of the Merrimack River that we try to avoid, but this is not from a sewage treatment plant. This is from the runoff. This happens to be in Methuen, but you can see the debris. You can see, these shopping carts. And there have been bad moments reported and things coming out of the Merrimack River. There have been tires, bicycles, even automobiles. I only know this because I was with the newspaper. And so bad things can happen to a nice river, but things are getting better. But this is an example of something officials want to improve upon. This is Newburyport. And again, you see this is not from a sewage treatment plant. This is from rainwater that came off of, if you know Newburyport, there's High Street and many collector pipes. And this is the boardwalk of Newburyport is quite beautiful these days. And I think city officials are trying to determine a way where they can improve their water system. And so they don't get as much rainwater going into the river. As there's all sorts of impurities, there's oil, gas from the automobiles, the occasional beer can. It's not a beautiful thing, but people are working harder to improve. I think you can see the beauty of the Merrimack right here. It has been a great source, a great asset for the community. Now, several years ago, when we talk about pollution, several years ago, a national group called American Rivers named the Merrimack one of the 10 most vulnerable rivers in the country. Now, of course, the Mississippi was there, the Hudson was there, but for this given year, the Merrimack River was there. One was the sewage discharge that we talked about. Another was chemicals going into the waterways, which we talked about. And another is, there's getting to be more building on the North Shore. There's quite a bit of building in New Hampshire. And so I think the scientists want to be sure that the pipes are clean and that the development that goes on in the future tries to do the best they can to keep the water clean when it goes back into the Merrimack. And here's one of the great shots that I've seen recently. This is by Dan Grovak, who is, a regular person. He has a real job, but he's also the head of the Merrimack River Watershed Council. This is a beautiful shot. The Merrimack can be very beautiful. And this is going over the area in Newburyport and Salisbury. Senator DiZoglio, as mentioned, has been a key leader with the Merrimack River Commission, and she and others are working quite hard to improve, to make the sewage treatment plants cleaner, to make sure that when there is an overflow, people downriver will be aware of it. And also, I think she's trying to get some of that federal money that we talked about to improve sewage treatment plants. Now, I know when you folks woke up this morning, you probably were not thinking that you would be seeing a smiling picture of Richard Nixon. But I must say that he does have his name on some good things. He turned out to be somewhat of a rogue during Watergate, but this is Nixon in 1970. Now, we talked about the Cuyahoga River catching fire in Ohio in 1969. That made everybody aware. Nixon himself put his name on the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, which started in 1971. Hubert Humphrey's in the middle, and Ed Muskie is also here. So it was an interesting thing. Nixon, does have his authorship of the EPA, but I always have to think it's kind of funny because when Muskie and Humphrey were able to pass the bill for the Clean Water Act in 1972, Nixon vetoed the bill. But people worked together in those days. The bill was passed over the veto, and the Clean Water Act started. So if there's one takeaway from tonight, it's that clean water started in 1972 with the Clean Water Act and has been improving since then. This is the end of our presentation. I want to thank everybody for being with us. And this is a situation where it's beautiful looking upriver. This is from Moseley Pines in Newburyport. And I've enjoyed working to learn more about the river. And I hope that you folks enjoy learning a little more. I had never been up to New Hampshire. Very few people, I think, have been up and down the whole river. So I've tried to give a little show of what it might look like. And I have a book coming out April 25th, but I'm more interested in just getting the information out there. And I thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dyke. That was wonderful. So we have a Q&A, some time for Q&A set aside. So if you have any questions for the author, just feel free to submit those in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them. We do have one question from Michael Toomey. He wants to know, he said the Eagle was anchored off the U.S. Coast Guard base during the opening dedication of the new station in 1972 or 73. He said when they were ferrying dignitaries to the Eagle, there was a massive 2-day fish kill out there, and he was wondering if they ever found out what the cause was.
I don't remember the cause of that at the moment. I do remember the Eagle, which is a Coast Guard vessel. It was built in the 30s by Germany. It was taken by the U.S. in 1946 as a war prize. It is now used by the Coast Guard Academy down in New London, Connecticut. And I don't quite remember what the fish kill was about, but as we've talked about, sometimes there are emissions upstream now in the, maybe we'll learn more about them than happened at the time. But, sometimes until recently, a lot of officials did not have to report when they had emissions. You folks might remember 4 or 5 years ago, Hooksett, New Hampshire had this new way of dealing with their water sewage treatment. And they had these discs, which were about the size of a silver dollar. And millions of discs were inadvertently released into the Merrimack. And as I understand it, they've ended up in Portugal and Spain. They're still at Plum Island. And so a lot of bad things have happened to the Merrimack, but that's why I named my book Merrimack, the Resilient River. It's still going, and it's still quite an asset.
Great. We have another question from Yvette. With global warming, possible sea level rise, are there more flooding concerns in the 2020s?
That's a good question. One of the reasons people are so concerned about the sewage treatment plants is with climate change. When it rains, it frequently rains more intensely and over a short period of time. And so sometimes, as we've discussed, all this rainwater goes into the sewage treatment plants. The plant can't accept it all, and then they discharge it. So it's a good question. People are concerned about that. At the moment, it's pollution that I'm thinking about. It's hard to really look into the future to see what a storm surge would actually do. But so far, there are several committees on the North Shore to talk about storm surge and maybe get ready for the time when we get a 100-year storm or something like that.
Jimbo Shane is wondering if they are still stocking salmon, or has that been abandoned, that effort?
No, they are. Actually, I think it's known that they can't get from Newburyport upriver, but upriver from Lowell between New Hampshire and Franklin, between Franklin, New Hampshire and Lowell, they are stocking, and there is still good fishing up there. I think there's a little mixed message out there. We do talk about pollution. On the other hand, there are many fish in the river, and stocking is still going on. And striped bass are still doing well here at the mouth of the river.
We have another question from Richard. In your research, any specific anecdote that particularly interested you? And he also wants to know if you can drop a link to pre-order your book. So a little plug for that. Yeah.
One of the things that I found remarkable was the woman I was talking about, Ellen Swallow Richards. She, was the first woman to graduate from MIT. She pioneered scientific clean water. It wasn't just done in Lowell and Lawrence. but it was picked up in different parts of New England and became a national standard. So she was quite remarkable. The other statistic, or a statistic that I did mention, but if it amazed me 15 minutes ago, it still amazes me, that 500,000 people get their drinking water from the Merrimack. I did not know that. I would have never guessed that number. Again, Lawrence, North Andover, parts of Haverhill. So that's a lot of people. And it was just interesting. There's good science, the water is good, but I found that remarkable that so many still get it from the river.
Carol would like to know if any are the fish safe to eat? Have they ever been tested?
That is a good question. I would say it depends. And, if you have any question at all, don't eat it, because at some of the areas in Newburyport say, the state does not want to recommend eating a fish or not eating a fish. So state officials are not very confident about it. I will say that striped bass that are caught at the mouth of the river are edible because they're just coming in from the ocean. They have not, spent their formative years in the Merrimack. So I think, that what people say is probably not to eat it, but if you catch something at the mouth of the river, that might very well be edible.
Good to know. It looks like, so Pat wanted to know if there's an organization that cleans the river, for example, shopping carts. And Jim mentioned the Clean River Project based in Methuen. So I don't know if you have more to say about that or any other organization.
Yeah, there are. One thing, the Merrimack River Watershed Council, I'm not an employee, but, they suffer me, let us say that. They had testing this spring. So they had a lot of testing where they had volunteers get water, take it to professional plants. So water is being tested constantly. At the bottom of the river in Newburyport, clams are taken from time to time, and water has to be tested for that. Now, there is a purifying plant on Plum Island. So any clam that comes out of the Merrimack River is taken immediately to the purification plant. So you'll never eat, clam right out of the Merrimack River. But there's a constant clamor to have more testing and just learn more about what is in the river. And it's different at different places. My understanding in Methuen, there are areas of Methuen. Oh, you asked about an organization. There's a fellow named Rocky Morrison who has a vessel, and he goes along and picks up all the things you're talking about, bicycles and shopping carts. He is not a member of a governmental organization, but he does pick up a lot of debris. He goes to city council and asks for donations so he can run this program. But yes, there is a program that picks up those shopping carts and bicycles. And I think that could probably be improved down the line, but some work is being done on that.
So these organizations are nonprofit or volunteer. They're not run by the state or local government.
The state does testing of the river, yes. The others are not, they're nonprofit or they're volunteers, such as Rocky Morrison, such as volunteers that went out this summer, such as the Watershed Council. There's a group called Storm Surge, and they study, what someone else brought up earlier. Well, what are we doing to, make sure that at a bad storm, the river doesn't overcome, downtown Newburyport or something like happened in Manchester many years ago. So there are groups like that. It's getting more organized.
So if you had, if you could recommend any organization that anyone watching this program could get involved with to help with river cleanup or testing or anything like that, what would you recommend?
I would say the State Department of Environmental Protection is a good one. They have a website, and you can ask them questions. I would mention that the state DEP is aware of the challenges in Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill. In fact, those cities are on record as having to clean up. So the state DEP knows a lot about this. You can go to their website and you could learn quite a bit more. But, it's expensive to redo a sewage treatment plant. So they're saying, look, you got 5 years, you got 3 years, or something good happens, like up in Manchester, New Hampshire, where that 20-year program was approved.
Great. Any other questions from anybody in the audience? We've still got a few minutes left, so feel free to submit them. Well, that might be it.
Okay.
So thank you so much, Dyke, for the
Well, Ryan, thank you very much. And Sherry, thank you very much for having me and enabling me to speak in front of some North Shore people and people who are interested in conservation and the North Shore.
Yeah, and if before we go, if you have, if you know of anywhere we can pre-order your book, if you want to mention that.
The only thing, Amazon is going to have them, of course. I live in a town that has a bookstore, Jabberwocky, that's Newburyport. Every store is going to have them, but that's what I would suggest.
Okay.
Jabberwocky and Newburyport, and maybe Amazon for the large picture.
Better to shop local. So
right, that's right. Go to Jabberwocky and any other place you can think of on the North Shore.
Definitely. All right. Well, thank you so much again. And for everybody that was here, we will make this presentation available online in the next few days and email out the link to that. So you can feel free to watch it again or share it with friends and family. But thanks again and have a great night.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us.